Hello and welcome to another video review. This is Spec Ops The Line for PC, Xbox 360, PlayStation 3, and Mac. This is a third-person shooter developed by Jaeger Development and published by 2K in June of 2012, and it was later released on Mac the following year. And it's kind of interesting, because this is actually the 11th game in the Spec Ops franchise, but nobody seemed to know the originals. So it was more like, oh, this is just this new game that came along. Well, no, it's actually the latest in a long-running franchise of tactical third-person and first-person shooters. So this thing takes a wildly different direction from all of those games. The question becomes, was it successful in this? Because it did some things that pretty much all first- and third-person shooters of the current era are too afraid to do. And part of that does extend to the presentation, which is decent. It looks okay, it runs on Unreal Engine 3, and it looks about as good as you can expect from that engine. They did a good job with textures, modeling, animation in general. The lip syncing is a bit off, and it looks kind of goofy sometimes, but you can live with it. They've done a surprising amount with facial animations, actually. It's pleasantly surprising just how much detail they packed into the facial animations, except for the lip syncing for some bizarre reason. The environments themselves are very much the whole brown and gray and realistic thing, but they did throw a surprising amount of color in this game as well. Granted, it does take place in what is effectively a desert. It takes place in Dubai, and it takes place after the city has basically been leveled by sandstorms. So you would expect there to be a lot of tan and such like that, because sand everywhere. But they've managed to take the colorful elements of Dubai and actually stick them in there at appropriate locations to make this thing kind of hauntingly beautiful. And they are not at all afraid to shy away from showing the violence that's being perpetrated in this game in a surprising amount of detail, and they are certainly not afraid to show the absolute brutality where it is effective. And so it creates this very interesting visual atmosphere that is fairly unparalleled. There are other games that have done similar things, but you don't normally see that in modern military shooters. So it's pretty unparalleled as far as its presentation and depiction of what's going on and this environment and how it all fits together goes. They've just done a phenomenal job with it. The sound design is also very well done for the most part. You've got a pretty solid soundtrack that fits very well with most of what's going on, and there are a couple of tracks here and there that just sound kind of odd, but you can get used to it, and it's just the way that the game works out. You don't really mind it so much because you're more focused on what's actually going on rather than the music. The voice acting is what steals the show as far as the sound design goes. They have done a phenomenal job with all of the voice acting. It comes across as very believable despite being often kind of ridiculous, which is interesting because you don't really expect ridiculous things to be believable. Yet they managed to pull it off in this, and I really do appreciate that they've managed to get voice actors who seem to actually care what they're doing, as well as good voice direction to actually help drive what's going on in the game home. The only thing that's really lackluster as far as the sound design goes is the sound effects themselves. The weapon sounds in particular. Some of them are really, really good. Like the M99 sniper rifle, for instance, sounds like a friggin' cannon. But other weapons just don't sound all that great. They sound kind of wimpy, pea shooter kind of things. And while the explosions sound good, by and large the weapons fire is just kind of meh. So that can be a bit of a detractor, but it's not so big that it's really going to drag you out of the experience entirely. But obviously what really matter here are the story and the gameplay, and actually in this game the story is the most important part of it. The backstory is that sometime in modern era, horrendously powerful sandstorms just start racking Dubai. And an infantry battalion, the so-called Damned 33rd, on their way home from the war in Afghanistan, go into Dubai to actually stage an evacuation effort. They say that there's going to be a caravan coming out, but the caravan never emerges, and the storm wall just basically takes the entire city. All communications end up getting just cut, and so Dubai is declared a no man's land. The 33rd are declared traitors, and nothing happens for about 6 months. So you play as Captain Walker, and he is the leader of a 3-man Delta Force team. It's him, Lieutenant Adams, and Sergeant Lugo. And they are going into Dubai to confirm the status of the 33rd and what's going on there, find any survivors, and then radio for extraction. That's pretty much it. They're on recon. When they arrive, they find Dubai in a horrible state. Obviously, the sandstorms have basically taken over the city with the entire sand mountain thing. But it's more than just that. They find that it's an absolute chaos. There's just a bunch of militants running around and taking out members of the 33rd, and there's just all this infighting and everything. So the real story begins when they're trying to figure out what's going on in the first place. What's happening here? And why is it happening? So, as you progress through the story, you find out more and more horrible things. And they've actually done a really good job of putting these things into context, making them surprisingly believable, and setting up the stage for you to actually get emotional from it. The plot itself is very interesting. It takes a lot of cues from things like the classic story Heart of Darkness, in particular, which, if you're familiar with the movie Apocalypse Now, you're going to be getting a ton of vibes from that in this. It's very clearly inspired, and the writing is actually the strongest part of this game. The story is interesting, the characters are surprisingly believable, the dialogue is surprisingly believable, and that all works very well. And the imagery that they use is very effective as well. Where the game falls flat on its face is the gameplay. You see, they had the opportunity to use the gameplay as part of their whole deconstruction of the modern military shooter, which is what they said they were trying to do. They said that the game is not supposed to be fun, which it isn't. There's no denying that, and you can very clearly see it's not supposed to be fun. It's supposed to be dark and grim and depressing. And what they've done with the gameplay, though, is make it an incredibly generic third-person cover-based shooter. Incredibly generic. 2-weapon limit, constant fighting with the controls because they're made around a gamepad, and obviously you're going to have 3 or 4 actions bound to the same key, in which case you're going to be trying to do one thing and the character ends up doing something else. Absolutely nothing with regards to the actual combat being remotely satisfying, which, again, understandable from what they were going for with the tone. But that's the problem. It's just an incredibly linear, cover-based third-person shooter. And I made the mistake of playing it on the hard difficulty setting. There are 4 difficulty settings. The one I played on was the second hardest, because you have to play through that to unlock the hardest difficulty setting. That was a mistake. I feel like this is a game you need to play on either easy or normal. Particularly easy, because the gameplay is not the strongest part of the game. The strongest part is the plot, the actual way that the story is told and everything. Unfortunately, the gameplay constantly got in the way of me getting into the plot. There were several moments where I was supposed to feel something. One in particular that is infamous among people who've played this game. You know what I'm talking about if you played it. And let's just say the Willie Pete bit. You'll understand. But bits like that are supposed to make you feel. And the gameplay had been irritating me so much that by that point I felt nothing at all. It was complete blank. Now don't get me wrong, it shows these things in gruesome detail. They have done a phenomenal job of just being completely unapologetic with this thing. It's like, oh yeah, this is how things are here. This is why this world is believable. We're not going to just shy away from this because, oh, it might be controversial or something like that. No, they show it, and they're like, yeah, this is how it is. Can you live with yourself for this? But at the same time, the gameplay just constantly reinforces, hey, this is a video game. Because you'll have moments like that, where it's supposed to be emotionally effective, and I can see if I was in the right mindset at the time, it would have been. But it's really hard to get into stuff like this when just before and just after you're spending about 5 minutes trying to take down a guy in a heavy padded suit who is taking about 100 rounds from your M249 saw to the face, and he's still moving. It's things like that that just completely break the immersion. Which is why I feel like this thing would be better played on lower difficulty settings, because it would be easier to get into the mindset and not be focused on the gameplay like what the harder difficulty settings actually kind of force you to do. It's actually kind of depressing how that worked out. I missed out on just all of this stuff because I got so tied up with the gameplay, because the gameplay was just so mind-numbingly generic and just so video gamey that it felt more like a missed opportunity than anything else. They could have used the gameplay to further tell the story and everything, and to some degree they did, but they could have done so much more with it, and I really wish they had, because that would have been so much more satisfying with regards to the entire experience. To add insult to injury, the gameplay feeling tacked on extends to multiplayer. The multiplayer is definitely tacked on. It's straight up every other modern military shooter out there, period. Unlock system, perks, custom classes, etc. And it runs on matchmaking to boot. Oh, and there's nobody playing it, so I couldn't actually get into the game. So ultimately, Spec Ops The Line is just killed by its gameplay. It's a real shame, because the plot's there, and if I was playing this on a lower difficulty setting, admittedly, I probably would have had a better time with it. But there's just so many missed opportunities with this thing. They could have done so much more with what they had if they just didn't stick to the whole, it has to be a modern military shooter thing. Even if they're claiming, oh, it's a deconstruction, or, oh, you're not supposed to enjoy it. Okay, fine. But make it a proper deconstruction. Actually pull the genre apart and be like, yeah, this is stupid. And explain why it's stupid through the actual game, not just kind of pulling it out and be like, yeah, this is kind of dumb, isn't it? So ultimately, Spec Ops The Line is a very mixed bag. On the one hand, I can recommend it based on its plot alone. It's an incredibly interesting game. It's got a very dark and mature story, and I like what they did with that. But on the other, if you're going to treat it as a game, you're going to have a really bad time, because it's just incredibly generic as far as its gameplay goes. It is not interesting at all on that front. But I still can recommend it. The thing is, I can only recommend it to people who are patient enough to put up with the gameplay. So that's why I'm giving this a 3 out of 5. Thanks for watching.